Welcome to the panel on free and open source software licensing, corporations, community, collaboration, and whatever the heck else we end up talking about. I'm expecting it to be a varied panel with lots of interesting questions. We'll be going through a few topics for discussion, and we're going to leave some time towards the end for audience questions as well. So first off, a few introductions. I'm Josh Triplett. I've been a free and open source software developer for a few decades. I've worked in licensing and co-led the corporate open source program office for a Fortune 50 company. For the last decade, I've been working on the Rust programming language team, and I'm going to be moderating for this illustrious panel of luminaries. So let's go through some brief introductions, starting with Eric.
My name's Eric Schultz. I am going to be a little bit different from this panel because I am not a lawyer. I really can say that. I've been part of the FOSS community for 15 plus years. I'm a project leader on Houdini project, which is a member project of Software Freedom Conservancy. I helped draft the web template output additional permissions to the AGPL to handle some situations that the AGPL didn't handle that was relevant to Houdini. And I served on a subcommittee of the FCC's Technical Advisory Committee dealing with open source software and lockdown of Wi-Fi radios.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. McCoy?
My name's McCoy Smith. I am a lawyer here in Portland. I also, like Josh, worked in a Fortune 50 company, the same one, on the legal side, and he and I used to work together. And I've been tinkering around in FOSS for legal issues for probably 25 years in a variety of different avenues.
Hi, my name is Kate Downing. I'm an attorney in private practice. I'm a solo. I have been doing open source compliance and open source strategy work for about 15 years. I started out by managing VMware's open source compliance process. I built out ServiceNow's open source compliance process. Surprisingly, their public company did not have one. They are not alone. And these days I work with a number of different companies. I work with companies that produce just commercial software, but also a number of them that also produce open source or some combination. And some of them are very small and some of them are extremely large and companies that you've all heard of. So I see the gamut in my practice.
My name is Mark Jones. I'm also an attorney. I'm currently with Cisco Systems. I've been there about a year and a half. It's my first big company, so I still have a lot to learn from attorneys like McCoy. Before that, I was at a small business, government contractor providing professional services around Drupal and other open source software platforms. I also represented a lot of open source community projects and individual open source developers before that. And then I spent about 15 years in government IT.
Okay, awesome. And a quick disclaimer before we get started. None of us are going to be speaking for any company, any organization, or any project unless we specifically say otherwise. Nothing in this panel is legal advice, and nobody on this panel is your legal counsel. If anybody else needs to add any other mandated disclaimers so they feel comfortable answering spicy questions, please do so now.
I just want to say, as someone who is not a lawyer, I'm definitely not your legal counsel.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, questions away. So let's start out with, so free and open source software enables a wide variety of entities to collaborate, individuals, companies of all sizes, communities, nonprofits, any kind of organization. How has the landscape and perception of this changed over time? How well are those collaborations working? What challenges are people facing? What do we need to improve? Let's start out with Eric.
Yeah, I think that the collaboration, just in my observations, I was thinking about this question a little bit earlier today, was the collaboration is extremely fragmented at this point. It's very different from, I think, how it was, I guess, perhaps before I got involved, maybe more than 15 years ago. But the projects that people are working on are very different for an open source projects. Things like you have these like ultra corporate open source projects, things like Kubernetes, which are quite different from the things that perhaps were being collaborated on in the past, which were things like GNU or the GCC compiler or anything like that. There's just, the groups of people are working on so many different things that there is isn't as much of a community connected. There were a couple. Another thing that I thought of is that the rise of the VC funded open source company and the VC rug pull has really, I think, changed how a lot of people who perhaps are younger look at open source. They don't see it as a guarantee because they're starting to understand some of these nuances. And to be quite honest, I think that there has been fragmentation in part from the rise of fascism. I think it actually has had a fairly significant effect. There are people who may have been involved in open source software in the past who find that there are things that are far more important to spend their time doing. And I can understand why they feel that way. And the other thing would be there are people who used to view open source as a social justice issue. And a lot of the people that are involved in social justice don't necessarily see open source that way. They've seen some of the issues related to fragmentation, the ultra corporate open source, and they're going in different directions. They don't see open source as a solution to that. So I think that has been something I've been observed as well.
Okay. Anybody else want to chime in on that question?
I'll just make a note since I'm the old person on this panel. I'm been doing this long enough to remember when there really wasn't any corporate open source, and the transition to the participation in open source by the corporate folks has been pretty remarkable. It happened about 25 years ago, and now it's everywhere, which, depending on your perspective, is a good or a bad thing, but it is significant.
Okay. Kate, you want to chime in?
So, every time I do one of these talks, and there comes to a point where people will start talking about, wouldn't it be great if we found better ways to pay open source developers? Like, wouldn't it be great if there was an easier way to take an open source project that people kind of half-heartedly put up, but thought might go somewhere, and then when it does go somewhere, allow those people to actually reap the benefits. And, there's always kind of this pushback, no, people do this for the love of open source and open, and that is great, and that is true. But, I'm a bit biased because of my particular viewpoint, but some of the arguments that we've had about open source and source available and all this other stuff that's come up since 2018, the lost point is that most of these arguments are two corporations arguing against each other, and people are taking sides. And I'm like, what are you doing? And I'm the problem here isn't that the one corporation is taking advantage of the other corporation. The problem is that they're all taking advantage of the individuals who contributed in the first place, right? And so, yeah, I think that some of the ideological conversations about open source need to shift in terms of understanding that a huge number of your players now are not individuals, right? But they're actually companies, and that you have to deal with that reality because their rights and their responsibilities just look very different from an individual.
I think all of that's accurate. To me, some of it is reflected in, 15, 20 years ago, if you told a family member or a friend who was not also into this that you did free software or you did open source, the conversation you had to have to even give up trying to get them to understand it. It just didn't make sense to people. People hadn't heard about it, and it was very underground. And it started having an impact, and now people know it's important. They don't really know what it is, and people are starting to ascribe meaning to it. So at least, with my clients now, they were like, oh yeah, open source good. It's a good thing. But then you try to explain to them okay, here are the implications. Here's what's different when you're doing it this way. They get a little bit more uncomfortable, but they're like, well, I know open source is this cool, good thing, but I don't really understand how it works. And I think that greater visibility brings more people into it. But I think we also need to understand, we should not assume that everyone's on the same page about how this actually works and who we're interacting with, which kind of reinforces some of you talking about 2K, right? It's not just a bunch of hobbyists anymore. There's a lot of stuff going on. And some of it, people are coming in and they're trying to make it what they want it to be or they think it is. And it's not.
Okay. So diving into a bit more detail then, what are some of the challenges from the past that have faced the open source and free software communities that are less relevant now? What are we spending time on that we shouldn't be instead of the challenges of the present and the future? And how do we make sure we're not fighting the previous war instead of the current or next one? Kate?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually take this question from the last questions and then go backwards. I will note I've been asked a very fire starter question. So, keep that in mind because I've been asked to opine on something controversial. But okay, here it goes. I think attribution is dead. That's what I think. I think we need to stop putting together thousands and thousands of pages of attribution notices that nobody reads. I don't think this is useful. I don't think a single person has ever said to themselves, hey, I'd like to go use this open source project after reading a 1,000-page open source disclosure, right? I view that as attacks on innovation that we do not need to be doing anymore. This is not useful. However, what I do think we need a lot more work on is source. Okay, and here's what I mean by this. So even the companies that have gotten it together enough that, they're creating OSS attribution files, they're creating SBOMs, the vast majority of them will still be scrambling if you ask them for all the corresponding source. They still cannot really do it, and to the extent they do it, they will do it badly. And that's not for lack of trying. I think it's for lack of tooling, right? Like, for example, here's things that come to mind. People who build from monorepos and then can't tell you what source code actually went into it because they don't remember how they configured it to build, right? Or people who take open source that's not like a release, it's not like 1.3, it's like some random snapshot of the open source that no one can ever find again, right? There's all kinds of tooling and coding hygiene practices that people use that make it really hard to actually provide the exact corresponding source code, right? And like some of the things like we could do, for example, is like package managers ask you for like a link to the project, right? So a lot of people will link to GitHub. Okay, but that is not the same thing as you actually like uploading source along with your binary, right? Because you may be pointing to a GitHub project that also contains, 100 other packages that are also provided separately, right? And the source may not actually correspond to that particular package. So I think that there are real like hardships in having people find the source code to things that tooling could help us fix. And I especially am looking at this from a regulatory perspective, right? Because from the EU, from the US, from like multiple sources, people are being told you need accurate SBOMs. And also like you actually need to be able to have the source code, not from a licensing perspective, but from a security perspective, right? And so I would like to see a lot more effort and a lot more kind of push, right, to make that easy on developers, right? Because right now, like what I'm seeing is that is like a hunt, like they're going truffle hunting to find this, and it really just shouldn't be like that. So that's kind of where I want the future to be. The other point I'll just make about this and like pushing people for source, right? Like on the Docker container stuff, right? Like this has come up there, and I'm just like, I give up. I'm like, just provide them the source to everything. Like, just do it, right? Which like makes Red Hat like a giant winner, right? Because they make it so easy, right? You could, they provide the corresponding container with all the source code, and I'm like, great, you've just saved like 100 hours of legal work, and you don't have to pay me. Just go do that, right? And I'm just kind of applying that, more universally, right? And I do think it's particularly important. You look at how much code is being written by AI, for example, right? And AI looks a little bit more appealing if like you don't actually have to attribute it. Like it doesn't become part of a 1,000-page notice, right? I can see people relying more on that. But that's another area where like we should actually push people, right? Like if you're taking code from AI, actually we want the source now more than ever, right? Because we want to know that it actually does what you say it does, right? That we can actually see it, right? So for security reasons, like I think that there should be a bigger push towards that. And I also think like I worry about with AI, like, are you people still going to be putting their projects on GitHub? Right? Like, I don't know. Like, if I can ask for something and you can ask for something and we can have the AI write the same thing, like, are we still going to be posting it? I hope so. Like, I hope that's still part of the culture, right? So, hence I'm underlining movement for source. That's what I'd like to see in the future.
Okay. So, anybody else want to chime in on challenges we're facing of the past and the future and which ones we should be focusing on?
I would agree with Kate that the relationship between open source and security is changing significantly, and I think there's a lot of work that people all around need to do. Open source is just too important to the world and to businesses and to individual consumers' lives to say, we're not going to worry about that open source free software stuff. Like, that's all made by community hackers. It's fine. We're not going to burden them. Like, the reality is it's a national security issue now. It is going to get regulated. Governments are going to be involved in this. It has, I mean, I think to free software advocates should be happy about it. It has a real impact on individual people's lives right now. Like, responsibility has to be taken for this, and we need to think about that. So we need to think about how does security and open source compliance kind of work together, and the benefits of it, and like, how does open source actually work, so we don't actually kill it with regulation. Like, what are the real benefits around it? And to Kate's point, like, it's probably not because there's attribution notices 1,000 pages long. Like, there's under fundamental principles there. I think the other thing that I would like to see that happens around the free software movement more broadly is doing more community outreach to other movements that are similar to it. It's for a long time been pretty insular, but related movements, open science, open data, Creative Commons, like, these have all spawned up on the heels of the creation of the free software movement, and they're interrelated, and we can make the effectiveness and the power and the inclusiveness opportunities that come with this better if we are talking about it just outside of a little bubble, and that some of those communities have things to learn from free software movement, and the free software movement probably has some things to learn from those other movements too that grew up without necessarily all of the confines or expectations from free software.
Sounds like a great opportunity for some intersectionality. Yeah. All right. McCoy, Eric, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, just one thing on the past versus the present. There was a time a long time ago where there were endless debates about how do we interpret these licenses? What do they mean? How do I deal with them? That sort of went away quite a long time ago because I think people became more comfortable with the licenses themselves and how they needed to use them, work with them. Interesting to see if there's any change in that. You know, there's a potential for some change in the law of copyright stemming out of all the litigation around AI, and I kind of wonder whether we get some interesting law out of that and whether that changes the way that many of us have been thinking about these licenses for a long time.
May we live in interesting times indeed. Yes.
It's great for lawyers. I'm not sure it's great for everybody else.
Oh, good for the lawyers. Eric?
I don't know that I really have a lot specific. I will say that that notice issue is something I've actually tried to do on a project, and I actually worked on. It's called Notice Me. Yeah, it's called Notice Me. It was a project of Clearly Defined that kind of got abandoned. I took it over to try to generate notice files. I had stopped doing them in my Git repo because my Git repo, like, the size of all the commits was just changes to the notice file. It was completely impractical. There kind of just needs to be a different way to handle that. I don't know. I mean, I think actually attribution is really important as a concept. I don't know that the way that it's being done now is how it should be done. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, attribution handling, making sure we have source, AI and all the associated legal challenges, the challenges of security, working with aligned movements. It sounds like we've got a lot of good challenges to try to face and talk about. So picking something specific and diving in a little bit more, recently we have seen a lot of attempts by various entities to push new licenses, to push new license terms, often trying to call them open. What should we be doing about this? What are some of the cases that you've seen? And are there healthy and effective ways we could address this and address the forces pushing people to try this kind of thing? So, McCoy, why don't we start with you?
So just a additional disclaimer, I recently joined the board of the Open Source Initiative, and the Open Source Initiative publishes a definition of what open source is and certifies licenses as complying with that. I think that's intended to be a mechanism to help distinguish between what is or is not truly open source. Now, there are other entities that have their own definitions or ways of looking at this, which you may choose to follow their principles or think that they are the best arbiter of that. how do you combat people calling things open that perhaps we could all agree are not? I don't know if there's a really good mechanism for that other than to say, when they say this is open, say it's not open and here's why. And if you continue to say that it's open, we will not accept it as that, or we will state publicly why we don't believe that. I'm not sure that there's a more robust mechanism than just sort of the use of the public forum to address that, but I'm open to other suggestions. Yes, I will speak up.
All right. Other folks' thoughts on what we can do about this, either by any particular means, or what might be motivating it, and what we can do about that.
I think what's motivating it is referencing what I said before is like, it's cool. So a lot of people want to do open source now, whether they know what it is or not, but they know it's cool. I think it's also a big motivator for a lot of companies as well. They understand that the open source brand will attract a lot of people to their products, and it's a way to get a good jump start around it, and they don't understand the implications for it. Or they understand the implications for it, so they decide to do something that looks like it's open source, but it's just definitely not. Or they start calling things open because at least now they're not misusing the term open source, but they know everyone will misinterpret it, because when you start saying it's open, people think you mean open source. They think you mean the values around it. It's a problem because it's a communication gap. A lot of engineers just think like, oh, it's open source. I was able to download it off of GitHub. I was able to download it off of Hugging Face. I was able to download it off of random university website. There's no restrictions on what I can do with it. I'm like, well, that's not really true. There's a lot of people who are providing licenses to the public that are super restrictive, that aren't open source. So I think it's coming up with vocabulary. I know for me personally, especially around AI models, there's so many of these AI model licenses that are not open source. And I got so frustrated going into every meeting and like being this little nag of like, I'm sorry, can we stop calling these things open source? And I didn't have an alternative vocabulary for it. So like, at least inside of with my clients now, it's like, there's models that are publicly available. That includes open source models. I'm going to start talking about publicly available models and like the different risks associated with them. So like there's a vocabulary for it, but we need vocabulary for the other things that exist. It's not enough to say, that company's producing a license that's not open source. Like, well, what is it? Like, how do we talk about it? Because it's not proprietary closed source software anymore either. Like, how do we describe this thing? We need to give people labels so that people understand the distinctions that these different kind of licensing models bring to the community.
I mean, I do want to point out that, two of the traditional ways that, open source companies have made money, right, is either by charging support or by charging for hosting services. Like, and it is a real issue, right, that somebody like Amazon can come in and just do both of those things better than you. Like, just way better than you, right? Can even take the project, fork it, and maybe even develop it going forward better than you, right? Because they have access to the, more sophisticated clients and like better like look at what the problem is and what the needs are, right? So there is that real concern that, two of these pathways are gone. And so then I ask like, okay, well, what are the pathways left? Because, some of the other pathways I am not like a big fan of, and I think may actually be less clear and even nastier, right? Like when people try to license their source code one way and then they license their binaries another way, or they have, a repo where it's like supposedly this thing's under MIT, except for a handful of AGPL files, and good luck finding them in this like source code repo. And maybe you included it and maybe you didn't, and I hope you checked the right flag, right? Like I find all of that stuff way more dishonest, right? Than just a license that's like, this is an open source license, but Amazon don't use this. Like, I find that to be much more straightforward to understand and to use than all these other methods that are quote unquote pure open source.
Yeah, I might get on my high horse on this one a little bit. So I just want to see who here has actually worked with AWS, like tried to manage anything with it. Could you raise your hand? Okay, who liked doing that? Okay, because in my experience, it's one of the most convoluted tools I have ever worked with in my life. I am regularly banging my head against the table. So I appreciate that for very large companies who are automating a lot, one could argue that it's okay that AWS is cheaper or they have better salespeople. For most people who are like below a certain size, there is no way that AWS is guaranteed to be the best solution because the UI is just awful. It is just abysmal in every way. I've never had a tool that I dislike as much as AWS. So I kind of, when I hear those things like these startups or the VC funded startups, they're like, well, we can't compete with AWS. I'm like, seriously? Really? You can't? Like how? So in regards to that, I think that one of the things that has happened and one of the reasons that this is, I think, popular right now, is that that people appreciate the idea that there are massive corporations in this world like Amazon who have way too much power. And there are very wealthy people at these VCs who are funding them, who are funding these VC funded corporations who are exploiting that and saying Amazon is stealing from us as the little guy. But they're not the little guy. They are billionaire funded or billionaire funded. They chose to go about this way that they are that they're VC funded, that they're not a started up on their own and go on their own revenue. They decided they wanted to build a completely new open source project from scratch. They decided they wanted to get a license to all of the code so they could relicense it. They decided that they wanted to keep expanding to the point where they couldn't have linear growth. They had to have exponential growth because that's what their investors wanted. And then they're saying, well, I can't make this work. And my opinion would be, I don't care. It's not my problem. I'm not your investor. As your user, I don't care about that. And there are real consequences to some of these restrictions. And I don't want to take the entire time, but I think these consequences are actually really important to discuss.
Awesome. And honestly, thanks, Eric, for keeping it spicy. Like, that's what we're going for here. Like, it is reasonable to ask, like, is this a business model we want to support? Where is this coming from? Should we be trying to help meet that need or not? And also seconding the point of don't be terrified of competing with AWS. You might not win a race to the bottom, but maybe that's not where you want to be racing.
Absolutely.
So taking a step past that then, do you think that it is possible or desirable for us to evolve the frameworks under which we all collaborate while still staying true to our principles? Should we do that? Could we do that? And if we did, how would we agree on how it would happen?
I think part of the problem here is not a lot of people know what the principles are. So I wouldn't, I think I have a good understanding of like the principles behind open source and free software, but I'm pretty sure that not everyone in this room was going to agree with me, and that some of the people in the room are very well informed and would have an informed opinion about it. To me, a lot of it is around autonomy and control of your relationship with technology is the underlying thing. There's also a lot of community building. So I think you can evolve frameworks. You can move past copyright and look for things that have similar ethos with where you can apply similar principles around respect for individuals and autonomy. Yeah, you can do that. At the same time, and I don't know if this was an accident. I think it probably was a mix of accident and some intentionality. There are certain things about the way open source licenses that make it work. And it's not really up for a debate, I don't think, as a practical matter. A lot of the pushback that people in this space get around open source licenses, like, well, we need to be able to restrict the uses so that we can charge people who can afford to use it. I'm like, yeah, but as soon as you start restricting these uses, like, I think it just doesn't work. So maybe open source isn't the solution for everything. It's not appropriate for every use case, because if you want to have this massive network effect, like, there are certain practicalities that it has to work with, and it's not really a debate. It's just how human societies work. It's how economies work. So there's a mix of things there of like, yeah, we can work on the principles, but what are they? And like, which ones are choices and which ones are just like, if you want this level of impact, that's the requirement.
Fair enough. Kate, you want to add to that?
I think we also have to be honest with ourselves that open source has been like way more successful in some parts of the tech stack than others, right? I just think that there are places where, you know, either by the nature of the technology or by the historical accident of the technology, it totally makes sense, right? And other places where it's really hard to build a business and be in that part of the stack and be open source.
Can you give some examples of like parts that you see as more or less successful?
Well, obviously Linux, right? Obviously, like the operating system level, and in part because there is that separation, right, between user space and kernel space, which makes it easy for people to understand. Aha, GPL good here. Aha, GPL bad here, right? Like it becomes like this very easy demarcation that like you can play in this sandbox and then you can get out of that one, you can play in a different one. I think it's you know, especially copyleft, I think is a lot harder when you have more questions around what's going on and the legal and technical interactions and how they work under a particular license.
Okay. McCoy?
I don't know how one changes collaboration models. I'm happy to advise people who want to come up with new stuff, but I'm not sure I could ever come up with any better way than what people organically do right now.
Fair enough. Eric?
I think it was a really broad question. I think it's really I mean, there's all broad questions, so that's not a problem. But it's kind of difficult. I would actually argue that I think we should redefine what we are trying to create as something that focuses on digital autonomy. For those who haven't read I recommend reading the Declaration of Digital Autonomy by Karen Sandler and Molly DeBlanc. To techautonomy.org. When I read that for the first time, it was just like a lightning bolt. Like, this is it. And it, in summary, it redefines what we're talking about in a way that is broader than open source and literally does not mention open source, but is completely implied that that is what it is included in digital autonomy. So I think that part of it is, if we are going to go in that direction, I think we should move towards something that is a little bit broader. And I think that'll be more understandable to a lot of people, because I think people understand that they are losing their privacy, that they don't have control over their lives. They are not going to understand what source code does as part of that directly. They might understand that source code access and rights related to it are useful in some case, but they don't understand, well, how does this actually affect my life? And if you can kind of like build that continuum of it's from the top to the bottom, and there are areas where it needs to be interacting, and they all kind of are part of the same fight, then I think people the activist community will grow over time.
Quick follow-up to that one. I've seen that document as well, and it's a wonderful read. Do you believe it would be possible to look at a document like that and come away with a unified set of principles that everyone agrees on and could follow, or would you end up with as many different interpretations as there are readers?
Can I go first?
Yeah, please,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I would argue that that you probably could do that, but you wouldn't have the same people in the community as we do now. Okay. It would be a different community, because there are certain groups of people that, particularly like very large corporations or people that want to use open source but then create like some sort of a proprietary add-on or whatever. That's not going to make any sense to them. That isn't what they want. But I think there definitely could be unification. It'd just be a different community.
Okay. So one more question, and then we'll dive into audience Q&A. So for each of you, what do you think is the single best innovation that would make FOSS and the FOSS community better? Let's start with Kate.
I mean, I think I already mentioned it. I think package managers that ask you to upload source code, actual corresponding source code when you upload to the package manager. I said I already mentioned it, which is I think package managers that prompt you to actually upload the corresponding source code when you upload your binary.
All right. Sounds good. Mark?
It's a little similar, I think, to Kate, but certainly from a business perspective, but I think it matters for community habits too, is more structured and consistent ways of communicating the information around licensing and how things are being built and dependencies, so that I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of packages that go into products. The reason why this works is because of scale. And if we want to make sure that we understand how all of this stuff works for security issues or respecting people's rights, like we need to be able to scale that too, and that's more structured information.
Okay, fair enough. Eric?
I think it'll just go back to my last answer, is focusing on digital autonomy as a goal, and less on the specifics of that it is open source. It's that it's part of digital autonomy.
Okay. And McCoy?
I think the best innovation would be for either the Congress or the courts to come up with better, clearer guidelines on the application of copyright to software.
Fair? You want to be slightly more specific?
I want to dream a little dream. The way that the courts have handled these questions has been quite shambolic for quite some time. And Congress has shown no interest in unshambolicking it, although they may be motivated now because of AI.
Whether we will like their answer or
Yes,
not is another
we
question.
may not like their answer because they may make it worse.
Or asymmetric.
Yes, but clarity, the more clarity we have, the better we are able to operate under understandings that everybody shares, or everybody at least understands. The less clarity there is, the more ambiguity is. Now, of course, good for lawyers. More ambiguity, I'm not sure that good for lawyers is a principle that we should be striving for. Although it's good for me, it may not be good for the rest of humanity.
All right. So now is the opportunity where if you feel that I have not managed to keep things spicy enough, it's now your chance. So if you've got a question that has been inspired by the conversation you've heard so far, or just a burning thought that you desperately want to hear this wonderful set of luminaries talk about, then this would be the time for your questions. So let's hear it. So I'll hand go up right here first.
Yeah, I have a comment on the. Should I do that? Yeah, recorded about my.
Yeah.
Please do, and also, please make sure your comment ends with a question mark.
Okay. Yeah, I have a kind of comment, which is the whole not being able to compete with Amazon. As I understand it, that's like the big dollars come from the big clients, and so it's not being able to compete with Amazon for those dollars that I think they might be talking about, and whereas like your point was like, for making it usable for everybody else, there's competition, but those aren't the dollars that I don't know if they're going after.
So
All right, comments from the panel.
So I do, and I did summarize that, and yes, that is what they're doing. I would actually say that in a non-open source way, I have a very clear example, is that the company I work for, we use Heroku. Heroku runs on AWS, but it is way simpler to manage websites than it is to use AWS. So this idea, and they have large companies, and I would also argue that, or large customers, I would actually argue that you can be very successful in open source and in this industry without massive customers. The issue is that you're not going to get the kind of returns that a VC wants.
So my question is more related to the digital sovereignty issue. As somebody who's in lead developer on a desktop Linux distribution, how do we get the general public to care about these things? Because we are somewhat handcuffed by things like software patents on multimedia codecs, by things like lockdown handsets, which keeps us locked into the Apple and Android duopoly of controlling the mobile space. And the larger issue of it is, at this point, is in the communication, is how do we get the general public to realize that Google and Apple don't care about them and are actively harmful?
All right. Well, given the mention of digital autonomy, I think we start with Eric and then go from there.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to be taking the whole time. I would say that people know that Apple and Google don't care about them. Maybe Google more they think that than Apple, because Apple has done a really good marketing job. But people know, like the people know that they're getting screwed over. Like, and people know that they, in some level, that they don't have control over their lives, that they feel like they don't have control over the technology that they use. So I think that there is a sense out there, and it's connecting it all together from top to bottom. It's taking the things where people feel like their privacy is being violated, and going and helping them understand the entire stack of everything that isn't implicated by that.
So problem and solution end to end. Okay. Any other thoughts from the panel before we go on?
Yeah. One thing you're probably aware of, but would be good to participate more in, is the right to repair movement. Here in Oregon, we just within the past year and a half have passed a right to repair law. There are various other states in this country who have done that already or are in the process of considering it. And that's beyond just electronic devices. It's a lot of different things, but you can see that there's a little bit of a political movement around the concept that you could draft on. Right. Yeah, it's the tractors really piss people off the most, but
It's a real.
I'm from tractor country. I know it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting angle. What would it mean to say we have a right to repair of software, and would that magically give us open source or something close to it? It's a reasonable thought.
I did want to just mention a couple things. Is that Denver has done a really great job on working on right to repair and software. And
Here.
Yeah, his talk on the box model yesterday. And I just wanted to mention a tweet that I saw a few years ago. It said it's amazing that right to repair for software is basically free software, but the marketing is way better for the term right to repair.
So this is for the legal people, and as someone who works on free software, especially for being able to supplant non-free systems, the two big challenges we have are software patents, as this guy over here mentioned, but also we're handcuffed by by restrictions on being able to do interoperability. Like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act provides a very, very narrow vehicle for doing interoperability as long as it doesn't conflict with all the other things. Like, how do we square with this? Because like it handcuffs us for being able to be able to supplant these other systems, because people use computer systems to achieve tasks or to watch movies or entertain or whatever, and like without the fascia of being able to do interoperability to be able to do those things the same, not necessarily the same way, but achieve it, we're kind of screwed. So how do?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. I
Did it.
I think, well, one of the things you're talking about, though, right, is like there's people building captured audiences, and the reality is that, like, we live in a capitalistic society. I'm not aware of other economic systems that I think operate wildly better. They all seem to have some misfortunes. And there are people who are going to be in this system who are always going to engage in trying to capture as much of the market as they can. And like, that's just going to persist, right? I think to point Kate made earlier, is like, it's unfortunate when they kind of go about that in duplicitous ways by representing like, oh, this is an MIT project, except for the HEPL code I buried underneath, so I can catch you on a licensing thing later. I'm like, well, maybe we already have some legal remedies for lying to people in commercial transactions. Maybe we don't apply well to that. But duplicitous business practices are bad. But like, people are going to try and capture that. One of the challenges around the free software and open source business models is you usually need to accept the fact there's this trade-off between creating a huge pie and the fact that you don't get to eat the whole pie anymore, like you're gonna have to let other people profit from it. So that's part of it too, is like if you want to have an impact on the rest of the world, you have to be okay that you're giving it away. And I think as people in the technology side of these things too, we also need to recognize people do care about these things. They might not have the skills. So a lot of free software is made for developers and engineers, right? If you really want to give the freedom to other people, what you might need to be focused on is, how do I make this software usable to people who don't know how to do this themselves, which is a selfless act. But you also need to be comfortable with the fact that like not everyone's going to be on board, and there is this conflict. And we do actually have a lot of interoperability in our society. We just don't see it anymore, because that's what happens when interoperability is there, right? So I don't think it's doomed. It's just that we notice the friction more when people try to keep those capture gardens.
It makes sense. If we were going to have autonomy, then the right to repair also has to mean the right to have repaired. So fair enough.
Just one more thing on software patents. You know, this has been an item of discussion in free software for a long time. The news is bad. I mean, the Congress right now is increasingly become pro-patent and anti-challenging of bad patents. So, I mean, call your congressperson, of course, but be aware that the mood right now in DC is extremely pro-patent and anti-public domain.
Is the mood also pro-DMCA, as asked earlier, or is that just not even on the radar for anybody to consider?
Depends on which part of the DMCA.
You
Right.
know which, the anti-circumvention specifically.
Yeah, I don't think they want to move on that.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't like the 230 stuff.
Right.
The anti-circumvention, I don't think anybody pays attention to be honest.
So, McCoy, I think you understated it when you said that for-profit companies were embracing and participating, I believe is the word you used, with open source. What they're doing is co-opting and dominating it. And it relates a lot to what Kate was saying with regard to not having complete corresponding source, including all the modules it contains with the scripts used to control compilation and installation like we're supposed to get. What we're seeing is a simple fact that's always true in activism. Activists always say budgets are moral documents. If you underfund something on purpose and you're a smart actor, you're making that decision consciously. And that's exactly what's happening with complete corresponding source. The engineering would be better. It would benefit the companies if they actually did their engineering well enough to deliver the source. They are not doing it. And I'd like to ask, particularly the corporate panelists, why is it that you're continuing to give us this false narrative that to just, oh, there's no engineering, it's hard. It's not hard. It's unfunded because you want to get away with violating copyleft.
So I will say I have a biased view because I talk to people who want to talk to me, right? So let's start with that, right? But of the people I talk to, like, I don't really come across people who like really want to get away with it. I mean, like I think that used to be a thing. Like, I think that was at the beginning of my career. But to be honest with you, like, for the most part, like, I'm working with people who are like, compliance. Compliance is important. We want to comply. Tell us how to comply. And they pay me money to tell them how to comply, right? Like, they're not paying that money for nothing, like, because they don't get anything just from talking to me, right? They actually have to go do the thing I tell them to do. So I don't think it's just, like, yes, I think there's a ton of like small companies where like they're just not there yet, and so it's not on their radar, and so they're not doing it. Fine. But I think that like for companies, like once they get to a certain size and like they have the resources and the bandwidth to do it, they want to do it. But it is really hard. Like, I challenge you, like, even with like an Apache project, like a significantly large Apache project, I challenge you to go and find all the source code to all of their dependencies, right? Because you look at the notice file. What's the notice file say? The notice file is, we use this particular project. Will it even tell me what version of the project they use? Maybe, right? Okay, so how am I actually supposed to go find the source code to every single dependency? And like, what if by the time I'm looking, the thing isn't up anymore, right? you know, like they're not providing me with all of the source code for everything that goes into their project when they build it, right? And I will also note that even Apache Foundation, like they're supposed to have two kinds of disclosures. They're supposed to have a disclosure for what's in the GitHub repo and then a separate disclosure for what's actually in the binary, right? So that that disclosure at least captures everything that ended up in the binary. How many Apache projects actually do that? I would say a very limited number. So like if you're a compliance person, right, and a lot of times it's a compliance person, a lot of times it's not an engineer, right, or it's a lawyer or something like that, right, and you're trying to go find like the 100 packages, you know, that this particular Apache project depends on, like, good luck. It is actually really hard. And even when I find a poor sap of an engineer who gets stuck and assigned to me and I tell them to go do it, they find it challenging. So the package managers are great, like they're a godsend in one particular way, but in another way, you were just having tons of stuff come in without you necessarily paying attention to what it is, and you have a trail of breadcrumbs that you then need to go follow in order to get the source code.
Any expansion on that, Mark, McCoy?
I mean, I wouldn't disagree with Kate. I mean, I get paid to help a company work with open source software in lots of respects. One of the things I work on is compliance, and that's what I'm there to help the company do, is to engage in compliance. So I don't particularly appreciate it being suggested that I'm lying about that, because I think I'm trying, right? And it's fine if people don't believe me, because I don't have the right for everyone to believe what I'm saying. But you know, I try to do my job as best I can. I try to live by my principles, and not everyone sees it the same way, and I'm okay with that. I don't need them to agree with me, but companies do try to comply. And I think Kate's right. If you look at open source community projects as well, there is this assumption, and I've worked with many open source community projects that were not corporate driven, and like, oh yeah, well, there's a compliance problem there, but we just kind of assume that because we're a community open source project, everyone understands how it works, until one day someone's kind of paying attention and be like, oh, except for that problem. And I think it's a different kind of problem for open source community projects to deal with that, because there's a lot of ego associated with the assumption that they know how all this stuff works. So sometimes they're less willing to kind of fess up about some of those problems because they're not sure what the consequences are.
A lot of confidence that is very true, because I package stuff in Fedora and it comes up a lot. There are many projects don't know what's in their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But surely in the age of AI, people will know what they are building, and
No.
Yeah, not getting better.
Mark, I didn't say you were lying. I said your client's lying. And I know that clients often lie to their own attorneys.
Congratulations, we have found the spicy one. Let's
I,
move on.
I will say to that like where I think there's like an exception is the closer you get to bare metal, like the more incentive you have to really like bend the rules on GPL and copyleft. And, you know, particularly when we're talking on chips, right? That in particular, like I will grant you that. But the higher up the stack you go, I personally, I don't see it.
So, speaking about in the age of AI, initially copyleft was built on type of copyright as a way to build and protect robust commons. With now LLMs, you know, scarfing in everything and then creating something that then gets scarfed in and rinse and repeat. I know the initial rulings were that anything coming out of these were not copyrightable, but I believe that's changed recently. I could be wrong. I felt I've heard whispers of that. But do we feel like, you know, if the entire copyright institution is going to have to be rewritten because of this type of thing, will copyleft still have a space in that world? Will instead we say, well, copyleft was used in the incorporation of these, so now everything coming out has to be copyleft. Do we have any thoughts?
No, let's not play that game. Let us not pretend for even a minute that AI models are copyrightable. We made that mistake with software. Let's not make it with AI.
Hey, if you want to get in that argument, let's absolutely make respect for current licenses be a thing. Let's have that argument, but let's probably have that argument in another 45-minute panel.
That's different from the argument about whether or not the model is copyrightable. That's a different question from whether or not the model is copyrightable.
Well, I'm specifically talking about the output of the model and the output, which is then going into new training data. But that output, it has been built upon something that contained copyleft code. The intentionality behind the copyleft, like the use of copyleft, is often because I don't want just my intellectual property to remain in the commons. I want anything based on my intellectual property to remain in the commons. And so, I mean, I think an argument is pretty clear there that was the point of that. And if that is in there, if that's what's being used, that's what's being trained on, then those outputs should remain in the commons as well.
Yeah, the difficulty is you actually have to have output which looks substantially similar to what was in the input, which is extraordinarily difficult to actually find.
I do want to say that it may have been a couple years ago. I did see someone who an LGPL, I think it was in C, and GitHub Copilot generated, it was like a 50-line function that was exactly the same, but it renamed variables. And like not as a lawyer, that seems problematic. It's not like a line of code. So yeah, it does happen. It's how often it happens, it's kind of hard to know.
They filter that out now, so it won't give you anything like that now.
Better,
To be clear, they did.
I didn't say it
that
made it all better, but I'm saying that it is much harder to find that kind of stuff to sue on now.
Much harder to find is definitely I'll ask that question for the panel. Like, leaving aside the legal instrument and whether it can be done with this mechanism or that mechanism, what do we do to prevent these things from becoming giant copyright laundering machines? Right.
Don't
So,
argue for
given that that's
copyrightability
not
of the
an
model.
acceptable answer, what do we do?
Don't give it any more IP protection than it needs to have. Don't give it any. Right? That is one step for
So
it.
now it's just a public domain washing machine, and it can steal things, but I can't.
Who in this room is not using AI for coding? At all? None of you are using AI for coding.
I used it
Wow.
once.
Not a bit,
It didn't
not
work.
ever.
I do not have the technical fix to the legal system to figure out how to make everything perfect. I would say, though, that I have spent a good portion of my legal career, I guess my entire legal career, explaining to people that, free software licenses do not have a price charge associated with them because it's not economically feasible. But there is a cost associated with them. It's the theory that underlines the enforceability of the GPL is like, yeah, there's an exchange here, right? Is that like these people are giving this code away for free and they're attaching conditions to it. Some of it is licensing notices. In the case of copyleft notices, they've attached conditions about like, yeah, this is the impact that I want, to your point, right? For better or worse, the way these licenses have been written have been tied into the legal system. So I think there's rightfully a lot of arguments about the scope of that. But my real point around this is like the idea that everything should be owned. Whether it be software patents, whether it be cultural practices, whether it be derivative works, whether it be the output of AI models, at least for me personally, I think it's okay for me to contribute something to the common society, have an impact on other people, and that I don't always have a right to take credit or to monetize it or dictate what that person does with it. And that's part of something we should be thinking about here too, is like, yeah, it's okay to decide where you're going to put your efforts out there. It's okay to ask for compensation for it, but it's also okay for people as a society to build a culture that we can all participate in, and we don't have to constantly think about who we've just incurred a debt to.
Not as the non-lawyer, I do think that it would be unwise, based as an engineer, and unfortunately I think it's likely to happen, to start worrying about like, well, what's going to happen in the era of AI? And as an engineer, I'm like, is this going to exist long term? And the question is, because it seems really useful for some things, but like it also seems extremely expensive and nobody is making money with it. And at some point, like someone has to pay the bills. And if you're investing up to like in the area of $1 trillion and you still can't profit from that, like how?
Somebody's gonna burn out.
Yeah, like somebody's going to run out of money. So it starts to beg a question: is do we need to reinvent the wheel for something that may become more of a niche than people think it is?
Other questions from the audience?
Yeah, so I was wondering on the situation where we were talking about being unable to find the source from something that we're getting upstream for an open source project. I guess I'm just confused, and I want to understand more about how this is happening exactly, because it's my understanding that if a company is using an open source project, they would probably want to build it from the source code. So
Nope.
I'm just not
No.
sure.
It all comes in via package managers. They take everything from Maven, et cetera, et cetera.
Java and the .NET world, they're binary first, not source first. So in the enterprise world where they do dumb things, it's very easy for the package managers enable.
So why do companies like don't you want a process that says I want to know where my source code is?
They
I
want it
mean,
to be easy. They don't. Everything else. Is
okay, well this sounds like a funding issue then.
No, it's
I-
it's a cultural practice.
I-
technology issue because Maven Central doesn't do source uploads.
So I will say that so I will say that as a software engineer, I care that it's open source so that in the event that I need to modify it, I can. I don't necessarily care about like the source code as long as I have a general sense of how it runs, because I just don't have time to review it. And that's where I look at it. It's like, yep, we're going to have all these NPM packages and they seem to do what I want, and I only have so much time, and that's what it is. Now, I care that they're open source because in a lot of cases we've had to like modify them. But if I don't need to modify them, I don't want to. Like, it's just like there is like a maintenance responsibility, and especially when you're in a small company like mine where it's like under 15 engineers. It's like we're just building these things for a lot of people, for companies. We don't have enough time, and so I get that. Now, I think bigger companies, that is less justifiable because they simply have the resources, whereas we don't. But I understand that on some level.
Okay, at the risk of breaking the spell of timelessness, I am going to observe that we are now through the slot and through the break, and if people want to see the next talks, they are now. There is no further talk in this room today, and so if our panelists wish to continue answering questions, then please do not feel like you have to immediately stop asking. But first, I want to make sure we take a moment and thank our illustrious panelists. So Eric, McCoy, Kate, and Mark, thank you very much for taking the time.
And as a member of the board of directors of the organization that organizes this conference, I hereby give you permission to continue the panel. And I also very much thank the folks from the corporate world that are willing to come to such an unfriendly audience and have no, seriously, I'm absolutely genuine. It takes a lot to come to an audience completely disagrees with you and make your points respectfully, and they all did that, and I appreciate it. But of course they're wrong.
And hey, we have it all on video, so people can decide how many people in the audience disagreed with them or not. So we will see how that goes.
So yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Josh.
I do want to make like a quick point, which I never got to make, and I think it's actually really relevant about licensing.
Please go ahead.
And one of the things is particularly in when we have these situations where people are trying to make like you can't run my software as a service with the source available licenses like Mongo had and all those kind of things. I think that is a bigger problem in like when I call the real world, where it's like you're dealing with like real small businesses, entities. And I want to give as an example is the company that I work for. We support software for abortion funds. And to be quite honest, they're committing a felony in 12 states approximately. And so the idea that I can own that if I want to run it as a service and pay someone to run it as a service, and I can only go to that vendor, basically means that they are completely beholden to whether that vendor is going to resist whether some powerful government entity or something is going to do that. So there are real consequences to like these fights about really billionaires and millionaires or billionaires and billionaires. And like, there's real people at the bottom of this that have consequences to their lives.
But that seems to misunderstand the problem, right? Or at least I think it does, because I have a number of clients who produce software and they include that code in their products, right? So that they offer that functionality to customers, but they don't offer it in a naked way like Amazon does. So I'm not sure that like the particular use case you're raising is an appropriate one, because if you just want to use that technology as part of your platform, you can. There's no prohibition on you personally using it.
So I would say that on a small small projects like this, you need to avoid the issue of like, you basically need to have a situation where you can pay someone to run it for you, and because realistically you cannot. And so there's like this, and you also care a lot about the ability to move service providers of some sort, like whatever those service providers are. So it kind of gets into this like, well, I mean, maybe there's a way to nuance it, but at the same time, like, there are real people at the end of this that are affected by this.
Asking a question to the room for a moment. This is the kind of room that's going to have a lot of enthusiasts for self-hosting and autonomy and all sorts of things like that. But who in this room has ever said, you know what, life is short and I could pay somebody else to host this for me? Yeah, that's about what I thought. Mm-hmm. So, like, we have the option of self-hosting. We don't always want the mandate of self-hosting. And, like, a lot of us are, you know, reasonably tech-savvy and even could do that, as opposed to an organization whose job is helping people to have access to healthcare or abortions or other critical services, and whose job is not hosting something.
Well, and again, right, if it's something your organization uses, you can pay anyone you want to host it for you. What they don't want is for you to charge other people money for you hosting it for them, right? So I just don't see how your use case applies here.
Those licenses would not let you pay for that, though.
Yes, they would. That's an internal use. You're not providing it to any third party.
You're paying a third party to host it for you.
Those licenses do not prohibit that. So long as your use is internal, so long as you're not selling it to other people, so long as your business is not selling their software to other people.
At that point, you're paying for labor for a consultant to write on your instance.
So
right.
Some other
right. It's for you. It's for your benefit. It's not for a third party. Those licenses would not prohibit you from doing that.
As long as they work for you instead of being an entity who does this as a job and gets good enough at it to do it for more people than just you.
Yeah, it stops the person who becomes a contractor who's like, I would like to be the person who can host this for your company,
That's right. Yeah. The person who wants to use it has to be the one that acquires the license, not the intermediary company. Yes, that's right.
And I mean, if you think about specialization, like that person, it is better. They become very good at hosting and being able to help these companies. It lowers the cost for all companies.
I actually haven't looked at any of those licenses to figure out whether they would prescribe somebody.
Yeah.
As long as it's always your own instance.
Well, it depends on the license, but surely they wouldn't write it to be so ambiguous that you would not want to take the legal risk.
That would be evil.
So let's go on and do another question. Oh, there we go. Got another question.
Hi. I really appreciate that a lot of folks on this panel mentioned that we should be thinking about the principles about, you know, what are we trying to accomplish with these licenses rather than like what are the rules? Like to pick at the OSI a little bit if you want to be spicy. I feel like you go to the OSI website and you see a list of rules of what it means to be open source, but you don't see an essay, an argument. Here's what it does for the users. Here's what it does for the community. Here are the stakeholders, and here's how these licenses are serving them, and why these are the rules that we came up with. So I guess, you know, when I'm thinking like one thing I'm thinking is that probably on Sunday would be great to have a session to discuss more of these ideas around what are the principles that we're designing these licenses for. And a question for the panel, I guess I was curious about is, I think we've touched a lot more on kind of the consumer benefits of like control over your own machine, that kind of thing, and maybe less on the sort of principles in business to business kinds of relationships, which is a lot of the kinds of software we're talking about. So curious to hear what you guys think about what are kind of the fundamental principles, what we should be trying to accomplish in terms of how business customers get treated in ways that we think are reasonable and fair, if that makes sense.
Do you mean like customers, like businesses buying from businesses?
Yeah, so like, you know, for example, I work on a team chat product, right? So our customers are mostly like, there's communities that we host for free, and there's businesses that are using team chat.
As opposed to businesses that are collaborating on something.
Yeah, like but buying the software, using the software.
Are we? Is this still a session that's being recorded, or are we just like?
I believe we are still being recorded. Yes.
The rooms are just being recorded, like kind of streaming. So.
Yeah.
You just see them still being recorded.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you're on the microphone, if you're not on the microphone, they won't be recorded.
He was going to say something spicy until you said that.
Yeah. If you want the off the record answer, it sounds like there might be one on offer later today.
No. I was just trying to clarify. I actually hadn't really thought too much about like the relationship between business consumers as opposed to in between businesses and individuals. I think it does change that a lot though. And this came up in Denver's talk a little bit too, or at least it made me think about it a little bit more is when you're thinking about the rights of individuals versus the rights of businesses. I mean, legally there is this presumption that businesses are more sophisticated than individuals, and that they should be more on guard to ensure that they're getting better deals. Which I think generally that's not wrong. You should be paying attention to that kind of stuff. But I think you still need to look at like those power imbalances too, right? I mean, that's just the reality of negotiating these relationships. For me, I feel like I've always been lucky in that when I've done contract negotiations, I've had clients who wanted win-win solutions, and that's the better long-term stuff. But some people don't want to do that, and I've certainly negotiated with other parties that were just trying to maximize their advantage right now to get as much power in hand. So I would say you should think about engaging in business relationships that you think are fair. How that translate exactly to like the open source world or software licensing, I'm not really sure, but people do need to make that decision about like what do you want from your business relationships. Do you want a fair one that's cooperative, easy to work with, long-term successful? Or are you trying to get the most leverage you can now to maximize the advantage now? And who are you willing to do business with?
Okay.
I mean, I think there is really a lot to be said for the fact that, maybe not the people in this room, but I would say most people, right, when they're interacting with software, they're really interacting with cloud services. There's very few things in their lives these days that run on device, right? I mean, even, Microsoft Word right now, everything you do with it now also on cloud, right? I mean, used to be one of the things that was definitely on device, not anymore, right? Like almost everything is on cloud. And like, okay, the cloud software uses BSD, they use permissive licenses, they use a bunch of GPL, whatever, right? Like, does it matter to me as a user? Does it make it any different? Does it help me in any way? No, right? Like, I do think that we have this space that I will not call it an open source space, but I think there is a space for something like an open sovereignty sort of license, right, where the software can be used by people in cloud, but for example, after a certain amount of time, even for that software, you have to provide the source code to the whole thing, right? Like I actually think that's the solution for AI too, right? Is like these time bombs, right? Like you can release this commercially, but after 3 years, 5 years, whatever, like this has to be something that is released publicly, right? Because even for the cloud, right? Like, okay, what difference does it make to me if you're using GPL? I don't get to see the code. I don't know how the code works, right? And then more importantly, like I don't know what you're doing with the data or where the data is going, right? And so like I do think like, if most of the software that individuals are interacting with is on cloud, okay, like open source software says nothing about most software that most individuals interact with. And I think that's like a strange place to be.
I think that's a really great point. And to extend that a little bit, we talked earlier about like what does right to repair mean for software if it's not like free software? What does right to repair mean for cloud if it's being hosted by somebody else? To take a moment and call attention to something that not everybody in the room might have seen, but that is related to what we do here. If anybody's seen the Stop Killing Games movement? Good, okay, surprising number of people. But yeah, like the fundamental principle there, while their version of it is specific to games, is very much like this thing has a cloud service. If the cloud service goes away, the game is dead. This should not happen. And it is the closest thing I've seen to right to repair for cloud. It's right to keep running when the cloud goes away. That is, there's a lot of ways you could interpret that for other pieces of software. There's a lot more you might want, but that sure is a first step. We need a lot more.
I just want to say that I've observed that too, and I've been actually kind of amazed at how quickly it's grown in like 2 weeks about how much anger and actually response that they've gotten from the payment companies.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely, when we were talking about building relationships and coalitions, I mean, I think that's a perfect way to kind of pull this all together, is that, in digital autonomy, it's all these things. They're all part of the same problem. It's just that they're different kind of layers of the problem.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and to your point about copyright law and copyright law changes, right? I mean, I think about this not just like cloud games, but like games in general, right? Like the company making it will go out of business, right? And like I want like the Internet Archive to pick it up, right? I want people to still be able to access it and see it. Like it's a historical thing, and like you're not around anyway. Like you're dead. Like who cares who's still playing it, right? And there should be an easy way to make that donation, but in fact it's not, right? Because they've licensed a bunch of technology that they don't have a right to like carry on, like license further after they're dead. But this is like where copyright law could step in and say like, hey, once a company goes out of business, like, for archival purposes and these historical purposes, like we can give it to these entities that will manage it and still like keep it alive in some way. That is definitely a missing piece. But that's the difficulty, right? Like this is why like you can't find like certain episodes of TV on like Netflix or whatever, right? Because they licensed a song, but they licensed the song for the episode to play on CBS. And so now that it's on Netflix and it has that song, that episode can't be on Netflix, right? And like this is is a little bit of silliness in my opinion.
Okay. So other questions from folks who haven't asked a question yet? Anybody? Sure. And a big thank you to our panel for sticking around longer and being willing to answer questions.
Since we're in overtime, my question is, are you open to a little bit of feedback? Because the rules are supposed to be what I just ask you questions, but I wanted to kind of jump in, but also honor the rules.
Yes, that's your question.
That is my question.
No, it's fine.
Hit us.
If it's on topic, then
Yes, I'm kidding.
All right, so for Eric, I think digital autonomy is probably a good summary, but also it's terrible branding. So if we can stick with the things that actually have leverage long term and get people behind it, like right to repair, like that's got running room.
Yeah.
Like let's put our energy into that, because we actually need to build coalitions here.
I agree completely. I honestly, I think I use digital autonomy because I think it summarizes more, but it's just simply because that's the word that I saw. So
Yeah.
I don't.
Can
Yeah.
you do?
let's rotate it around a little bit more.
Okay, just really, just
Let's rotate it around.
okay.
Anybody else who has a question they want to ask the room? All right.
Yeah, I just kind of speaking to this idea of everyone's on cloud services and such. At least my understanding is part of why the licensing could matter in this sense is for businesses or individuals being able to create APIs, being able to understand where those connections are, and then being able to host, cloud alternatives of the same piece of software. I understand from a proprietary model that you're just making our exact competing software, but using copyright as like a way to do that seems sensible to me. I guess when I hear the idea of an exploding clause, my brain first goes to, well, maybe we started at 3 years, but what stops it from being 70 years plus the lifetime of the creator? I mean, it seems like one of these things that do you put it as part of fair use? Do you put it as part of like what is the legal mechanism that creates an incentive for people to actually release the things that would be necessary to host these products?
So I mean, one of the most common examples of like exploding licenses, like that's the business software license, right? Which is, you know, it is essentially a commercial license, but says like we revert this to an MIT license or something else permissive, usually after a certain amount of time. There's a lot of variations of this, but that's like one of the most common ones that you see. And if the company is still around, right, like you could enforce the license, right? I mean, a license is a license, like you could enforce it. Why not? The question is what happens if they go out of business before that runway, right? Then that's an issue. Yeah. But I think like, you know, what I don't like and where I don't want to push companies is to this like very binary choice of like I'm either totally open source or I'm totally commercial, right? And like if you're gonna give me a bunch of shit like for licensing, like let's say under BSL, right, where I say it's commercial, but in 3 years I'll make it public. Like if you're gonna like slam me and drag me for it, well I'm not gonna do it and I'm just gonna make it commercial, right? Because that's the hilarious thing is that like all these companies that like switched, if they just started out commercial, no one would have said a word to them. So you're sort of incentivizing people to go towards like that binary side, and I don't really think that's good. I would rather get something than nothing, personally. I mean, you know, they should be forthright, right, that this is not really open source, that this is some sort of in the middle, but if they're forthright about it, I am okay with people experimenting.
Really good call out, Kate, by the way, like making that distinction of it's important that they be honest about what they're doing,
Yeah.
which is a different thing to blast them for, as opposed to, you know, doing this thing that is time locked.
Yeah.
Those are distinct and we should treat them differently, sure.
Yeah.
So we had a really awesome session here and a lot of amazing questions, a lot of amazing discussion. A thought to leave you with, there is a board with a bunch of little Post-its on it for organizing unconference topics. And after having this wonderful conversation, I imagine a lot of people might have a lot of thoughts for where to take it from here, whether it is how to work on public policy, how to work on branding, how to work on next steps, innovating on license terms, how to deal with AI, how to deal with the challenges of the day. If you have a fun idea, consider putting a Post-it note up. Consider reading all of the other Post-it notes that are there and putting dots of interest for what you might be excited about. So it sounds like our organizer would like to add something to
I'm not
that.
actually an organizer, but I mean, I work for the organization that organized it. But since Tracy's not here, I just want to let everybody know, because if you stayed this long, you're really interested in these topics. We did not get many submissions on the legal track this year. We actually had to construct this panel. And so a lot of people think because they're not a lawyer, they can't talk about a legal topic. You certainly
I
can
sure can talk
and
about a legal
should,
topic.
because legal and policy are, they sort of bleed to each other. Just start your talk with, I am not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, just like Eric did, and you can give a talk on any topic you want. And I encourage you to submit next year on this track.
So yeah, try something this year for the unconference, try something next year for the legal track or for this conference, you know, see everybody in Vancouver. And thank you everybody for participating and making this a successful session. And thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you.